Hello PennDOT Community Traffic Safety Partners. Thank you for joining us for another video which is being produced for you by the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Center for Injury Research and Prevention. In this video, Chapter 13B, we'll continue our conversation about qualitative data collection, focusing specifically on how to prepare for your focus groups and interviews, some moderator skills. We'll discuss tips for how to improve the process in your focus groups and how to troubleshoot common problems. We'll talk about how to get started with analyzing your results and reporting them. Preparing for your focus groups and interviews starts a few weeks in advance when you'll set the meeting times for your interviews or your focus groups. It's important to contact potential participants by phone or in person, or sometimes via email, at least 2 weeks before your meeting time. Send a personalized invitation rather than simply a group or a mass email. And make sure that you follow up with them by phone or email contact the day before your focus group to remind them about the time and location and to ensure that they'll be there at the arrival time. Now, if you're moderating a focus group, you'll want to make sure that you're mentally prepared and that you select an appropriate location that's convenient for all of your participants. You'll also want to record your discussion so that you can refer back to the focus group material later. But first get permission from your participants to record and make sure that they understand that the recordings will not be shared with anybody else and all of their feedback will be confidential and anonymous. An assistant moderator or a note taker can be exceptionally helpful during focus groups because these people can record nonverbals, help take notice of particular themes, and help with the discussion or the logistics for the group. Purposeful small talk is also helpful to ensure a smooth and a snappy introduction and to orient people with a warm-up conversation so that they can become comfortable sharing as a group. Pauses and probes allow people time to process and communicate. It can also provide you with a way to use subtle group control, so you can pull out more information from the people who you feel you need that from. And it's also important to control your reactions to everything participants are saying. Regardless of how controversial it seems to you, you are there to be a neutral third party and to have them enlighten you and to share their opinions and their stories. So try to avoid reacting to anything that they say. You'll also want to make sure you use an appropriate conclusion to wrap everything together at the end. We'll show examples for how to do this both in the moderator's guide in your resource book, and we'll talk about this more in a few minutes. The beginning of a focus group is a particularly critical time. You want to create a thoughtful, permissive atmosphere and provide some ground rules. You'll also want to set the tone to be respectful and positive. A recommended introduction pattern that works well is to start out by welcoming everybody to the group, giving them a little bit of an overview of what to expect today and the topic that they'll be talking about, laying out your ground rules of respect and confidentiality, positivity, and no right or wrong answers, and then beginning with your first question. To ask questions that will yield powerful information, you'll want to keep your questions open-ended to invite a variety of responses. Avoid dichotomous questions that just ask, for example, for a yes or no answer, because they're not going to provide you with very rich information. Why is a question that's rarely asked, but should be, because it helps you to get at some really deep information from your participants. Think back questions in a focus group, or when we ask our participants to think back to a particular time or a particular scenario where this was the case. Tell us about what that experience was like. Carefully prepare your focus group questions in advance, but make sure that you allow room and that you invite an atmosphere in your focus group where you can ask uncued questions by probing about what people have already said. Once you ask those, then you can go back to the cued questions that you've already prepared. And consider using standardized questions so that you can try to get an idea for how people feel on a range, and then ask a follow-up. So you said that you feel this way. Why is that? To get a little bit deeper into their multiple choice answer. At the end of a focus group, it's helpful to ask a summary question. So feed back to the focus group your perceptions of what they've been discussing and then ask them, would you say this is an adequate summary of what we've been talking about today? Ask participants to reflect on the entire discussion and then offer their positions or opinions on what's been said. That's called the all things considered question. And then finally, Have we missed anything? What have we not covered today that you would like to address while we're together? There are certainly some common pitfalls that can happen in focus groups and best practices for troubleshooting. For example, sometimes you'll ask a question and nobody will talk, or you generally have quiet participants in your group. What do you do? Well, the first thing you'll want to do is remember that people need time to process your questions. And then ask the group, would you like it if I repeated the question? Or simply ask the question again, but ask it in another way. And the other thing you can do is to kindly turn to somebody in the group and ask them to get the ball rolling. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have a person or two people in our group that constantly want to dominate the conversation. It's important to remember that a lot of times these people are like this because they're just really excited and they want to contribute, and they're not always aware of the fact that they're doing this. So the first thing we need to keep in mind is that the best way to deal with them is to validate their contributions. Another way we can handle this, because we'll want to project this back to the group, is to ask to hear from somebody else specifically. So if everybody in your group starts raising their hand and you know you've already heard quite a lot from Megan, turn to Sue. Sue, you've been kind of quiet. What do you think of this? It's okay for Megan to sit out one or two questions. Another way to help simultaneously validate the person while also projecting out to the rest of the group is to ask the group how their experiences compare. How do others' experiences compare to what Megan has been saying? That simultaneously validates Megan and brings it out to other people in your group. What if you have a know-it-all in the group? Somebody that likes to answer their questions in a way that makes everybody else feel like their answer, if it's different, is the wrong answer. Well, again, we'll want to validate their contributions and thank them for sharing, express their appreciation. Megan, I think you have a lot of excellent points, and it sounds like you have some strong feelings and experiences with this. Thank you so much for sharing them. I want to remind the group that these are Megan's experiences, and there are no right or wrong answers here. I just want to hear a range of all people's experiences. How do others' experiences compare to what Megan has been saying? Something like that is usually a great way to handle a know-it-all in your group. What if you find yourself running out of time? Quickly look at your moderator's guide and skip any upcoming questions that are similar to what's already been discussed. Another thing we can do is say to our participants, in the interest of time, I'd like for us to transition to a new area and go into an entirely new area of questioning. Whatever you do, avoid the temptation to move on to a new question after you've only heard from one or two people, because the whole point in your focus group is to get a range of opinions. And also avoid the temptation to just get agreement or disagreement or head nods from people in order to move on. The systematic analysis process starts while you're in the group, as you'll be constantly reflecting on what they're saying in order to ask the questions going forward. But immediately after your focus group, you should debrief with your note taker and update any notes that you have about the experience to make sure that you're on the same page. Soon after the focus group, within 24 hours or so, you'll want to start analyzing your focus group results by reviewing the audio. And when you do that, listen for any questions that tripped up your participants. Were there certain questions that you found that you had to reword because participants didn't understand them correctly the first time? In that case, you'll want to revise those questions for future focus groups. And within a few days of doing a focus group, you'll want to start analyzing those focus group for themes for results and involve at least one other person in this process. And finally, you'll prepare your report. When analyzing your focus group data for common themes, consider if there were particular words that came up, or what was the context for certain responses. What were the areas of internal consistency among the group? Were there certain comments that came up frequently or were particularly intense for people? If you have very specific responses from your groups, consider how this varies both within an individual focus group and across your different focus groups. Because what you're looking for are the big ideas, the big themes that came up over and over again in the different groups. And you'll also want to consider differing viewpoints and inconsistencies between your groups. When you report your qualitative findings, it's important to be thoughtful. Remember that interviews and focus groups are all about striving for enlightenment, not about sharing a right or wrong answer. So you'll want to consider looking for group themes, but also sometimes sub-themes to help enlighten further. If there are particularly memorable points that people have made, pull those out and quote those in your qualitative findings. It's okay if your qualitative findings take a narrative format or a bulleted format. That's really going to vary based on the type of report that you prepare. And it's also important that you include both positive and negative feedback, because the beauty of focus groups and interviews is that they can provide a range of really rich data for us to evaluate our programs. Spell out the communication strategy that you want to use. Are you preparing your findings for a report, a newsletter, a presentation? That will influence the way that you write up your final results. And most importantly, in qualitative data collection, we have a lot of common limitations. For example, you'll probably have limited sample sizes, and you'll have to be mindful and remember that your focus groups or your interviews took place at one point in time. They're not necessarily representative of an entire long time range or an entire group of people. There's also inherent self-report bias that people might have. One way to help validate some of the findings that you get in focus groups and interviews is to do follow-up surveys that go out to your larger target audience. You can see an example of what qualitative findings look like in a report by investigating the resource book. You have just completed the final chapter in our section on program evaluation, qualitative data collection, delivery, analysis, and reporting. Thank you so much for watching.